we go.
Okay, hello everybody. I'm a nurse care manager at Iona. And what I was saying before a little bit is that as a nurse, I was aware that patients are not prepared for end of life. And so what a better place than Iona, who the motto is age well, live well. And also we added on die well, because it's not something we think about. There's a great quote that said, talking about death won't kill you. And it's so true. If anything, it assures that you'll have a better death, a better end of life. So we put together 2 years ago, we put together a end of life expo. Maybe some of you might have heard of it or came to visit. We had a lot of people attend. And one of the many programs that we had that day was looking at green burial. And so I contacted a funeral home that I was familiar with. I'd been a hospice nurse for many years, working with low-income folks, moderate-income folks, and the organization that I most loved was RAP Incorporated. It was a family-run nurse funeral parlor, and so I made just a cold call, and I met Lily Buerkle, who's a mortician there, and we connected so easily because she's very passionate about alternative forms of end of life and burial. And so we have been having monthly sessions throughout the pandemic on end of life issues. And we've developed some ideas of folks interested in looking at green burial. And so we thought we'd bring in the expert that we know of locally. And Lily generously agreed to do the program today. And I just want to say that she's a mom and she's been home with kids all year, and also working as a mortician. So she holds life and death and balance, and very beautifully. And Lily, we're just so grateful that you're coming to this larger community to share your information. And I just find you so accessible and compassionate. So thanks for doing the program today.
Thank you, Dixie. Thank you, Lena. Thank you. I guess I want to start with saying how much I love Iona on a personal level. When my dad was alive, when he would come up from Atlanta to visit, I would use your senior loan closet every time. I would get the shower chair, the transfer wheelchair, the walker, and I feel indebted to you guys already because really the visits wouldn't have been possible without that. So just want to say thank you for that. And I want to say thank you for those who are listening here today, because it's been quite a year and you guys want to talk about death on a summer day. So thanks for being here. I will start with, I'll talk a little bit about how I got into this. That seems to be one of the biggest questions that I get. And then let's just make sure. I will say this past year I was not honing my Zoom skills. So there was a lot, I was busy. There was a lot going on, but Zooming was not one of them. So let's just make sure we're in good shape here. Here we go. I don't have many pictures of myself at work, but this is one of them. This is, I can tell it's during sort of the heart of COVID in DC, and I think only took a photo that day because I was going to be the only person at the cemetery with this person. Some cemeteries were so strict, it was just me in the casket a lot of times. So that's a shot and proof of my children who I have dragged to Arlington to bring cremated remains, probably when they were off on a day from school. But I got started in this about 6 years ago. I had thought about it since I was 18. I always considered this work, and I never listened to myself. I had lots of jobs that I did not love, and I stopped kind of fighting that need that I have to work in service. And I started cold calling funeral homes. I found a funeral home who would let me come and work with them. And then I decided that I needed to go back to school for it and get the education required and get licensed. And while Dixie mentioned, I love the home funeral movement, the home vigil movement with death doulas and death midwives, which we'll talk about. They were the most welcoming part of this world when I was first showing interest in it. Traditional funeral home people are always looking for good help, but they also are very insular. Like, who wants to do this work? So anyway, I definitely appreciate the home funeral movement happening, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Let's see if we can get the slides to cooperate. Here we go. So this is a little tongue-in-cheek that I don't want you to be good at death. And what I mean by that is sometimes when I'm talking to families, I get the feeling they feel like they have to memorize every part of the process. And that's not really the case. You know, if you're working with somebody, they're going to tell you what they need from you. But I want you to have an idea for what you want. I want you to be prepared. You know, it's coming from all of us. And I want you to communicate with your family. Have a basic file. The file can be one piece of paper with all of your most vital statistic information, which we'll talk about, and what you think you want. But just have the very basics so that your family will know how to move forward. And, you know, if you have family who don't agree, you need to have those conversations while you're alive. So before we get started, I want you to think of someone in mind that this information will apply to. It could be yourself, it could be your mother, it could be somebody in your family, a dear friend, but just have someone in mind, and then that will hopefully help you work through any specific questions that you might have. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, good. Oh, and I should mention, because I'm going to tell you about my quirky pictures you're going to see. This is a photo from Glenwood Cemetery. It's a historic cemetery off of North Capitol Street. I had not been there until recently. It is so neat. I highly recommend checking it out if you can. What they do, they have trees on this cemetery property that are over 200 years old. And when the trees fall, they bring out a chainsaw artist and they carve straight into the tree. So there's really neat carvings all over the cemetery. That's like something serpentine there. Okay. Okay, so the first thing that I want us to talk about is you have your person in mind and death just happened, and I want you to think about who your first phone call is going to be, aside from obviously, you know, dear family and friends. One of the first things that determines who you're going to call is where you're dying. So if you die at home on hospice care, hopefully on hospice care, your first call is not going to be to the funeral home. It's going to be to the hospice nurse. The hospice nurse will come out and you will be pronounced. And then at that time, that's when you can make that first call to the funeral home. If you're at a nursing home or an assisted living facility, there's going to be nursing staff there. A lot of times they will call the funeral home and notify them. If you're at a hospital, your person is, you know, going to be moved to the hospital morgue, and then you can begin to make your plans from the hospital. If this is a death that is unexpected, unattended, perhaps unnatural, that the first call is going to be to the police, and they will come out, they will inspect the scene, and they will call the medical examiner and see if they want to accept the case. And if they want to accept the case, then you'd be going to the medical examiner's office. If they decline the case, then you can go ahead and call the funeral home. We find that sometimes people, you know, they have somebody elderly in their family, they're at home, they're doing okay, but they don't have them on hospice care. And even though it's a natural death, they have to make that first call to the police. And that can be really upsetting for a family. So I'm a big believer in getting people on hospice care if it's right for them, because it makes that transition a little bit less dramatic and less upsetting for you in that moment. When the police come out, you know, they're inspecting a scene. That changes the whole feeling. So really consider that. Dixie, did you have something you wanted to say? Okay.
Just thumbs up. I've been to a lot of deaths where they weren't under hospice, and it's quite an ordeal, and a lot of people show up and it's very disconcerting.
Yeah. So do you have to be picked up right away? This also depends on where you die. If you're at a nursing home, most nursing homes, they want their bed back in 4 hours. That's pretty standard. Sometimes it's 3, but most of the time it's 4. And so they're going to expect that funeral home come right away and pick up your person. Um, if you're at home under hospice care, you have some real flexibility here. So, and I really like it when families take advantage of it. When they are with you, they are yours. They are 100% yours and no one else's. Pronounced, you want them to be pronounced, but you could tell the funeral home, we want you to come at 8 o'clock tonight, or we want you to come at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Um, that's okay. We would do that. You know, we will give you that time. If you have somebody driving in from New York who wanted to say goodbye, let them. So you don't, I think there's a frenzy that comes over people and they feel like they have to do something. And, you know, sometimes you just need to sit with that person and you need to take your time. And this is special time because once they leave, you know, that's when they're not yours really anymore. I mean, they are yours, but you don't have full control over the when you're going to see them. And we'll talk a little bit more about having that time and using it because you can dress them, you can give them their final bath. I mean, there's things that you can do in that time frame, and it's therapeutic for you if you can bring yourself to do it. I mean, it depends on the person and the scenario and all of that, but consider using that time if you're able to, if someone dies at home under hospice care. If you die in a hospital in DC or Virginia, there's no real set time. DC hospitals, you know, I mean, we sometimes it's a couple weeks before sometimes someone calls to say I need to make arrangements. In a Maryland hospital, they would never allow that. You get 72 hours, and after that mark, your person would be transferred to the state anatomy board. So if you are likely to die in Maryland, you want to have your funeral home in mind. I mean, you want to have this in mind anyway, but if the Maryland hospitals, they're pretty by the book with that. After you go to the anatomy board, the general rule, and it did change a little bit during COVID, is that you get about 2 weeks, and then they will move forward and they will cremate you if no one has claimed you. So what funeral home you call, this depends a whole lot on what you're looking for. If you're looking for what's called a direct cremation in the funeral world, which is just a simple cremation, the funeral home is picking up your person, they're getting the necessary authorization to move forward from the next of kin, handling cremation, filing the death certificate, you know, having you be able to come in. That direct cremation, you will pay anywhere from $1,000 to $9,000 in this area. So if that is really all you want and you don't need access to a really nice facility, you know, you don't need that, then, you know, you can put your money elsewhere. One great way to sort of judge how expensive or inexpensive a funeral home is by looking at their basic services fee. This is the engagement fee to work with that funeral home. Every funeral home charges it. It's kind of their overhead. So if you're talking to a funeral home that has a basic services fee of $7,000 or $8,000, you're going to know that's an expensive funeral home. If it's, you know, $1,400 or $1,600, then that's, you know, maybe closer to what you're looking for. It depends on your budget. But if you want a really full service funeral home where they're going to have 5 people working that funeral service, they're going to have, you know, full staff, nice facilities where you can have a nice gathering, then maybe you do want a nicer funeral home. There's no, you know, wrong way to go. I mean, I would call and I would get quotes. There are some that are better regarded than others. And certainly the nicer, fancier ones, you will get more service from them, but you don't always need it if you're just doing a simple, you know, cremation or a simple graveside service. You don't always need that. And these pictures, actually, this is the first picture is this is from Birch Funeral Home. It was old funeral home on M Street in Georgetown that is no longer. The one on the right is Latney's, and they are still in business. That's, I think that picture is from 1938, but they're right on Georgia Avenue. That is now a condo building, but they are still in business elsewhere. That's an old African-American funeral home in DC. Okay. I don't know why the slides are moving slowly, but let's see if we can, here we go. Okay, this is sort of the, the real basic administrative part of death. Whether you call the very fancy funeral home or, something that is lower key, they are all going to ask you for this vital statistic information. And this is something you would want to have in that file we're talking about, what you want, but also your basic information. You all would be shocked to know that your kids do not know your mother's maiden name. That is the number one thing people do not know. I don't know why. Nobody knows their grandmother's maiden name. Go and quiz your family. You will be shocked. So, this is the very basics. This information goes on the death certificate. It's also used to generate the paperwork at the funeral home. It's your name. You guys you see it, but social security number, your marital status, your race, your residence, where you were born, your occupation. Occupation shows up on the Maryland death certificates. On DC, it does not. DC has more of a short form death certificate, as does Virginia. Veteran status, your parents' names, and then, of course, the next of kin. Next of kin, if you are married, next of kin is your spouse. If you are not married, you have adult children, it would be your adult children. If you are not married, no kids. It depends. It could go back to your parents if they are living, and if they are not, it would be your siblings. So in those scenarios, if let's say you come from a big Catholic family with 8 people, well, make sure that you guys are on board with your wishes for your funeral. And if you're not, this is when it's very important to have a personal representative or to get your executor to handle your funeral arrangements for you. And you want to specifically put that in your will, that you wish to be cremated, you would like your cremated remains interred at Park Lawn, and you wish for Jamie Shafter to carry out those plans for you as your personal representative. That's really important. So if you have family that doesn't agree, you need to get that in writing, have it in your will. That way the funeral home will rely on that. What they don't rely on is, well, one person says they don't agree with this, and 3 people, because they're always worried they're going to be sued. So they really, one of the big things is who is the person who has the right to make plans for disposition. If you don't have that person in your life, you need to get somebody. It's very important. This image, this is Frederick Douglass's death certificate here, which was so neat to find. I was able to find a lot of these images on the Library of Congress. Died at 78 years old. Very neat. So your death certificate, how many are you going to need? What do you use them for? Most people get about 10. Some people with tons of assets, tons of accounts, they might get 20. That's pretty rare. Most people can do what they need to do with 10. A lot of times you may need less than that. There's a cost per death certificate, so that plays a factor. In DC, they're $18 each. Virginia, they're $12 each. And in Maryland, it depends on the county. So you want to get, the amount you need and not spend too much more than that. You will need an original for a life insurance policy, a pension, property transfers, IRAs, 401ks. A lot of times when you go to a bank, you'll take the original with you. They'll make a copy of it and they'll give it back to you. So you're not going to need an original for every account that you have. If you don't get the right number, you can always get more. Once they're filed with the state, you can order more. You can order them through the funeral home, or you can go online and order more. And when you are proofing, the funeral home is going to send you a proof for your death certificate. Have your family proof it very carefully, because there's so many opportunities for human error. So just check that proof really carefully. If you're not sure about the spelling of someone's name, check it. Ask your aunt. Ask somebody in the family. People know. Okay? So I have here what to expect at the arrangement conference. The arrangement conference is what the funeral home calls when you go in to make your plans. And a lot of times, it depends. If you're doing a very simple service, you may be able to do everything over the phone. They may email you the paperwork. You may discuss all of the details. You may even discuss flowers. There's a lot of online casket catalogs now. You could even pick your casket out. So it depends on what you want. If you want to come in, of course, you should do that. But when you go into the arrangement conference, you should expect to discuss, the when, where, what of where the service is going to be, if there is going to be one. And right now for this, we're talking about a very traditional service. We're talking about, if you want to have a visitation, if this person is going to be embalmed, if the casket will be open or closed, if you want flowers, if you'll have pallbearers. You will discuss payment. Most funeral homes want to be paid before the actual service happens. They'll insist upon that. They may take a life insurance or a policy to pay for it, but they'll expect to be paid before the actual date of the service, not necessarily at the arrangement conference. One note about caskets that I want to talk about. You can get your own casket. You can get your own urn. You do not have to buy a casket from the funeral home. Funeral homes don't love it when you bring in what they call a third-party casket. You can do it. It's legal, and they have to let you do it. And they can't charge you. It's not like bringing your own wine to a restaurant. Well, they'll let you, but they charge you a corkage fee. They can't charge you anything. So you can bring your own casket. Most funeral homes will ask that you be there to receive it and inspect it, because if it comes in damaged, they have no recourse if this was from someone else. But it's perfectly legal. We've had many families do that recently, and it's worked out. It's fine. This is an image from, I think, the 1930s, a Washington, D.C. funeral home that is unnamed, and the flowers are pretty spectacular. So what will you do with your body? So, everyone likes to talk about the mushroom suits, and I feel like, there's a lot of things in vogue in death that people love to talk about, they love to write about, but I don't get many calls about. So, and I hope I'm getting there. I hope we're getting there, but I've never gotten the mushroom suit phone call yet. But what I want to tell you, what is cutting edge, is knowing what you want and telling people, and then being prepared for it. And that will always be cutting edge. This is an image from Gate of Heaven. This is a Catholic cemetery off of Georgia Avenue in Maryland. And this is a great picture of a grave liner. And the reason it's outside of the grave, normally when you get to a cemetery, the grave liner is already in the grave, and they lower the casket into that liner. And that liner is what keeps their grass so flat. That's why that grass is so flat in that picture, because when the big equipment, the big machinery comes over it, that is what's protecting it. But this is definitely during COVID. That cemetery in particular was very strict, and they would have their crew come out in a hazmat suits. They would spray the casket down with bleach, and then they would immediately put it inside the grave liner and close it and lower it immediately, with no family allowed to be present. And I'm glad that's not happening anymore. So we talked a little bit about simple cremation called direct cremation. This is a pretty good image of what a crematory would look like. They do sort of have an industrial feel. There are often family rooms that you could view the beginning of the cremation process, which is called a witnessing. And that sort of cardboard looking box that's an alternative container. That's what the funeral world likes to call it. But it is basically a very sturdy cardboard box. It's used for safe transport, and it sort of combusts inside the incineration chamber. So, it's not with the remains. I mean, it combusts because that inside a normal retort, as it's called, that incineration chamber, it's 1900 degrees, 2000 degrees. So you're not going to be left with that cardboard box. But direct cremation can be I know it's not exciting, but it is very practical sometimes. In the DC area, we find so many families have one kid living in Thailand and another one in California. And, this does handle the disposition. It does not handle memorialization, but it does buy families time to figure out what they want to do. If they want to gather in a month when everyone can make their schedule work, it does that for sure. And you can make it special. So let's talk about making direct cremation special. So if your person is at home with you, take advantage of it if you want. I think a lot of people think that they're going to be so upset in the moment, but you might find great peace in the moment. I don't think you're going to know exactly how you'll be, but if you are able to, it's very therapeutic if you can find a way to dress them, put them in what you want them to be cremated in, because whatever you send them in is what they're going to be cremated in. Comb their hair. You can put notes in their pockets. You can have little kids in the family make drawings that go with them, and then they feel like they're part of it. I had one family during the heart of COVID that nobody could be there, and they emailed me about 40 different letters that I printed, and then that person was literally blanketed in memories and words from the family, which is a really sweet way to do it. So you can make even a simple cremation feel special, and you can, take part in what happens a little bit. Body donation is it's just not as commonly done. This image is from Howard University's medical school. They were practicing for receiving a victim of an air raid, and I think this was taken in like 1938. Right now, body donation options in DC, Howard University, Georgetown, GW, George Washington University no longer does their body donation program. They had some trouble with maintaining the identities of those bodies, and they ended that program. But Howard and Georgetown still have one, and they're used for their medical schools. I mean, this is really how the medical students learn. Also in Maryland, the Maryland State Anatomy Board, they handle distributing all of the donated bodies to all of the medical schools in the entire state of Maryland. And then there's also Uniformed Services, which is in Bethesda, the military's medical school. And that's how they're trained as well. So body donation is definitely an option. It's something that you need to arrange ahead of time, and you need to make sure your family's on board with it. But there's paperwork you sign ahead of time. You also need to have a backup plan. All of these places have the right to technically refuse receiving a body. So you want to have a backup plan as well if for some reason they don't want to receive. So this is an image from Congressional Cemetery, which remains one of my favorite local cemeteries. They really let families do what they want there. But we've talked a little bit about simple cremations. We've talked about traditional services. There's other variations. You can do no church service and just have a graveside gathering. you can be transported somewhere else for a service back home, and that would require some embalming typically. But there are other things on the horizon here that let's talk about those. So this is what the equipment for water cremation, also known as alkaline hydrolysis, looks like. So this is sort of a pressurized stainless steel, I don't know what to call that. It's cylinder. We'll call it cylinder. I don't want to call it a vat. That sounds wrong. But 95% water is used, 5% alkali, which is normally potassium hydroxide. It's basically lye. It's a very basic, as in not acidic, solution. And then with that, it's heated to about 300 degrees to speed along the process. This was originally used in agriculture, and then eventually the Mayo Clinic started using it, I think in the 90s, and then it has spread across the country. It is legal in Maryland. It's just that no one offers it. The closest place locally is in North Carolina. This is sort of, it's much greener than traditional cremation because you're releasing much less carbon dioxide. You're not releasing mercury from fillings into the air. You're not using fossil fuels for it. You are using water. In the end of the process, there is residual water that is completely sterile. It does not have any DNA in it, and it is released into the local water system. And that tends to be a sticking point for some people. I will say this, that there's no escaping us being released into anywhere, whether you are released into the air and then, you go into the air, you're into the atmosphere, and then it rains, and then you come back down. We will all be released somewhere. There's no getting around it. So, and also, when you are being embalmed, there is a great amount of blood that it goes straight down into the local water system. And that happens all the time without anyone mentioning it. So I don't know. This is a much cleaner way to cremate. I think it would be wonderful if a local place would do it. I think a lot of people in this area would be interested in water cremation. In the end, you are left with bone, the same bone that you're left with fire cremation. It tends to be much whiter in color and powdery, I think because of the alkali, and without having that, the fire, the ash, as we say. So that's another option there. In Minneapolis, or in Minnesota, water cremation is huge. There's a couple places in the U.S. that it's huge. There's a lot of places in Florida who do it. There's a place in Texas who does it. Maybe it's coming this way. So this person is not dead. I don't want to alarm you, but this is from a workshop I took on home funerals, and we were practicing shrouding. So she is alive and well, just practice shrouding with each other. The home funeral, it's not for everyone, but if you can do it, I think it is so heartfelt. But basically, your person is home. They're at home. They'll do a vigil at home for 1 or 2 or 3 days. You'll use dry ice to keep that body cool. Depending on the time of year, maybe you could use an open window if it was winter. Dry ice or regular ice packs, and that is going to slow down the decomposition. And people will have their person there, and they'll sing songs, and friends will come by, and they'll eat around them, and they'll pray. And it's a very slow way to get used to the idea of someone not being there. I think it's really special. After that 3-day period, a lot of times cremation will follow, or a green burial. There are people called death doulas and death midwives who can kind of guide you during the process. And a lot of times those death doulas, death midwives will still coordinate with a local funeral home so that they can go ahead and file the death certificate and get the transit permits, because there is there is some, it's worth sort of being tapped into the local government systems. And there are states, and Maryland is one of them, that will let you sign your own loved one's death certificate, file it on your own. But there's some real legwork in that. And I don't know, I think you would need to ask yourself how much time you want to be putting into figuring out the local government when you are hopefully grieving your person. But in this scenario, there is no embalming. It's all natural. You would normally use, if you were going to a cemetery, you'd be using a pine box or even just a shroud with no casket at all. So for local resources, there is an organization called Crossings in Tacoma Park, and they have death doulas. The National Home Funeral Alliance has a whole list of death doulas. That is a great resource. Occasionally they have conferences somewhat locally. If you have any interest in that, they're really wonderful. This is an antique embalming photo. The embalmer in this picture is Dr. Richard Burr, who is the grandfather of embalming, and he is he's on the battlefield. I don't know where this picture was taken, but it was, I think, 1863, and this is a soldier who has passed. So embalming really became in vogue after Abraham Lincoln was embalmed, apparently re-embalmed multiple times, and had a train ride that went through multiple cities before he was buried. And that was really the first time people decided they needed to preserve someone, because all of these people were dying far away from home and they needed to get them back home. So the embalming process itself, you are essentially replacing the blood in the body with formaldehyde fluid, which is converting those proteins. The best visual I can think of, it's like frying an egg. So you're converting those proteins into something that was loose and you're firming it up. And it does preserve the body quite well. I feel like embalming gets a bad rap. I'm a licensed embalmer. I don't love the process. I probably don't want to be embalmed. If you've ever seen the process, you probably don't want to be embalmed. But I don't want us to get too anti-embalming, because it's still really important for a lot of families and some traditions. The whole home funeral movement, green burial movement, people within that movement will tell you that is not a very diverse movement. It tends to be a super white movement. And I think over time, I don't know what will happen, but I just don't want people to think embalming is wrong all the time, because there are many families who this is still very important for, and it's part of their tradition, and it's part of their way to grieve. And so while it's not necessarily my cup of tea, it is right for people sometimes. And it's right when sometimes there's been a violent death and that person needs to be restored, and that is important for that family. I don't know. I try to be kind about the embalming, as I see that how important it is sometimes for people. Also, if you're transporting someone overseas, 100% you need that. And it is still within the Black funeral homes, embalming is still, king, really. It's what people are used to. It's what they want. It's part of their tradition. So I don't want us to say that there's only one way to do something. For green burial, there will be no embalming, no chemicals, no finishing on the wood of the casket. There would be no grave lighter supporting the earth, and the body could just be shrouded. You might not have a casket at all. And in this picture, I would imagine that casket would be lowered with ropes into the grave. This is another picture from Congressional Cemetery, which is a hybrid cemetery. This is Marion Barry's gravesite here, Mayor for Life. Congressional's great. They are as green as you want them to be, but it's not bona fide green, meaning, the person next to you may have been embalmed, they may have a grave liner, and they may be in a metal casket. But you can do on a personal level what you want to do there, and it's one of the few cemeteries that really lets people do what they want to do. I have, had families lead, a drum circle and just be lowered in just with a shroud only down into an unlined gravesite, which normally would only happen at a truly bona fide green cemetery, but at Congressional, they will let you do it. So a hybrid cemetery, if you're looking at cemeteries, it's basically a conventional cemetery that has some dedicated green space, green burial space, which means they're not going to make you get that liner. So like at Congressional, their earth is not perfectly flat, it bumps and moves and changes because it doesn't have that same support. This is the chapel at Congressional. They are in Southeast DC, and it's a special place. And anybody should go take a tour there sometime. There's a lot of life in this cemetery. People have dog walking memberships, so people are always in there walking their dogs. They will make sure they're not there on the day of your service. They do a lot of, they have like cinema nights, they have events. There is a lot of life in this cemetery. It's a cool place. Cool Springs Natural Cemetery. This is out in Berryville, Virginia, and it is a monk-run cemetery. It was consecrated by the Catholic Church, but it is open to everyone. And it's out towards the Shenandoahs. It's about an hour from here. It would be sort of a destination day trip, for your family, but this is 100% green burial. They do allow you to have a marker, but everything else must be totally natural, no embalming, no finish on a casket. That's a nice option locally. Duck Run. This one is in Harrisonburg, Virginia, or just outside of it. They are a little bit interesting. They have scattering gardens there for cremated remains. They have traditional lots, but they also have what they call renewal lots. And so your cemetery space is only yours for 75 years. And after 75 years, they could technically resell that to another person. And then Garden of Remembrance. I'm just trying to cover some local green or greenish cemeteries. This is a Jewish cemetery in Clarksburg. They do, and I will say that Jewish burials were the ultimate original green burials, all natural, no embalming, washing the body, shrouding the body. And in this cemetery in particular, their green burial section is open to interfaith families and Jewish people, but not to everyone else. But something to keep in mind if you want a green burial and you want it local and you are Jewish or happen to be married to a Jewish person. Okay, so this is probably what I get asked about the most, or people like to talk about the most right now. Human composting. Natural organic reduction is another word for it. And the one company who patented it and is doing it is called Recompose. They're out of Washington State. And what they're really doing is sort of controlling, they're putting the natural decomposition process in a controlled environment that they've got it down to, it takes about 30 days. So your body is placed in a vessel with soil and other plants, and they're taking advantage of the thermophilic, the heat-loving bacteria that help break down the body. It's my understanding that as you are in this vessel, the interior temperature in there rises to like 120 to 160 degrees, and that helps continue to break down the process. They also make sure that enough oxygen is getting within that vessel, which is also needed to break down your body. So after this 30-day process, soil can be returned to the family. You're not left with bone. The bone is also broken down here. You are given back soil. You could also choose to have the soil donated to a local forest in Washington State. And this is sort of a growing thing right now. It's very interesting. There's a lot of bills on the table to make it legal. It's now legal in 7 states. And this is probably the most cutting edge thing happening death-wise right now that actually seems like it has some real traction. I don't know. We're all meant to break down. We have all this gut bacteria just waiting to give us a hand the moment our time comes. And this sort of, and what's neat about this is that if you did a green burial, you would be going through the same process in the ground. It would probably take a little longer, but then you can't use that space again. So this is allowing you to have that process, but you're not taking up any earth, any real estate. And that's what I have for you guys today. So I hope I've given you something to think about and talk to your family about, or your friends, so you can start making your plan. Write down your vital statistics. Make sure your kids know their grandma's maiden name, and tell it to people. So that's what I've got for you. I'm glad to answer questions. This last picture is from my favorite green burial cemetery. It's where my dad's buried, just south of Atlanta. It's also monk run, and it is so great.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much, Lily. Do you want to stop sharing your screen?
Sure.
And then we can.
That was so fabulous. I have so many questions, and I know there's a lot of good questions in the chat, Lily. I don't know if you can see them, but I could read them off to you if that's helpful. So Richard says, my parents were in Cleveland, belonged to a memorial society, church affiliated, that contracted with a funeral home for prices determined in advance. Are there any such in this area where people can kind of predict what the cost will be and prepay, which is always really nice?
Yep. So yes, you can prepay for a funeral for certain here. Maryland, DC, Virginia, anywhere in this local area, you would go to the funeral home that you think you want to use. And there's 2 ways to do it. You can either do it through a trust, or they'll actually have you do like a funeral policy. And most of the time, those should be able to be transferred. So let's say you're planning to move to DC because your kids and your grandkids live here, and you're planning to be here, but then towards the end of your life, you decide to go to Florida. You should be able to transfer that policy to the funeral home in Florida, for sure. The advantage to doing it is that you can lock in the price at today's time. If you are imminent, like sometimes people want to prepay and their mom's on hospice. Well, that's not really what it's used for. It's when you think you have years out that it's really to your benefit. And so you'll lock in the price of that funeral home. They'll give you their general price list. You can pick out what you want, write it down. And when that is paid in full, you have locked in for that, so that when death occurs, that is what you'll pay. If you go to a different funeral home, whatever you have in that account will be applied towards what you do with that other funeral home. It doesn't mean that they'll guarantee those prices. It means whatever you have in that funeral trust account or whatever you put into that policy would be applied to what those funeral plans are that you make with a different funeral home. But most of the time, the policy is still good. The funeral home who performs the service has to turn in your death certificate, and then they are able to collect on that policy. So yes, to answer your question.
I just want to make a comment about pricing. I'm so aware that in every region, especially where there's disparity of incomes, and DC being one, that we have moderate income, moderate price facility, and then the very high end, and people sometimes seem to select a funeral home based on like a it's kind of a, I don't know, it's like being in a certain neighborhood or sending your kids to a certain school. And it just breaks my heart when people find out that because of the name, you're going to expect to pay a few $1,000s more for the exact same procedure. So just be aware of that. You know, I remember my sister and I had a big issue with that with my parents in Baltimore, and I knew that the price was way expanded than it should have been. So anyway, okay, so Kathy Smith wrote, how do you plan in advance if you want to use your organ donation or body donation? Who do you contact?
Body donation, you would actually contact those medical schools. Like you would contact Georgetown, they have a donor program, you would contact them. For the Maryland State Anatomy Board, the same thing. There are, if you Google it, I promise you will find it, but you can go to Georgetown's body donation program.
The last I've heard, when we did the expo, we invited people from the body donation folks to come to the expo. Georgetown had a waiting list, and part of the reason was that they had a program where you actually got the cremains back after the cadaver was used, and other schools don't do that, and so that's why they have a waiting list. I was not aware that GW has suspended their program, but in terms of organ donation, the Washington transplant community are the folks that you want to get to know, the Washington Regional Transplant Community. Also, when you sign up for your license, you can indicate there about organ donations.
If they, when you say a waiting list, you mean they weren't taking bodies right away? You had to hold onto the body to give it to them? Is that what I'm hearing?
I think they were putting people on a waiting list for applications. You know, like maybe they're putting a hold on it. So I would check directly with Georgetown about what they're doing right now.
Well, it seems like if Howard doesn't have that sort of thing, I would think Howard would be an easier place to donate your body then, right?
Yeah.
Howard, I mean, I definitely remember someone last year donating to Howard. So it doesn't come up as much as you might think it would. But they are definitely receiving bodies at Howard.
Yeah.
Now, you have to think about if it's important to you, what Dixie mentioned, to get your cremated remains back to your family. Is that important to them?
What was it? You mentioned the Washington Regional what? I said
Washington Regional Community Transplant, or it has an acronym. And they're the ones who sponsor, like if you go into the DMV and there's all these posters about donation, you'll see that they're really, they're the largest collection of organ donation in this area. And we had people who had transplanted lungs and hearts and colon at the expo, and they were so grateful that people had donated their organs, because it really meant the difference between life and death for them.
Now you can put this on your license, and what happens then? Does that mean that, I mean, is that paid attention to if you're in an accident or something and somebody sees that on your license? Will they send to the hospital or what? How's that work?
They will still get permission from the next of kin making disposition arrangements. So you definitely need to, have buy-in from your kids and communicate that.
Right.
The license sort of supports that, but they're not just going to go by that. They're going to listen to the person who has the right of disposition.
What if time is of the essence?
Well, in every hospital, and Dixie, you might be able to speak more to this, but if you're at a hospital and that hospital knows that you have something that would be really usable and helpful, they will normally go approach the family and say, hey, would you be willing to do this? And that sort of happens at the hospital level. The funeral home does not. We would receive that person after those donations had happened. And it also doesn't mean that you couldn't have, if having an open casket was important to you, donation does not impact that most of the time. Now, whole body donation, yes, but if you're donating bone or skin or cornea, then normally you could still have an open casket.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm gonna keep reading if I can. About.
I have a related question. Would that be all right?
I want to ask a question.
Go ahead.
I do not have the name of the organization now, but I have a letter from an organization. My objective was to not have anyone have to pay for my funeral. And apparently they will pick up your body and sell your, actually, I guess they sell your organs. And with the money they get back, they pay for your cremation. Do you have any information about such organizations and how legitimate they are?
I'm trying to think of, there was a company named Science Care who I think may have been working within that space.
I didn't hear the name.
I think it could be Science Care. I don't know. I'm going to have to do more research on that. So they were going to pick you up and, I mean, you're not, That's interesting.
Well, I think so. The idea is, and maybe you can expand on that, is how do you not have to pay for your burial, and how does anyone else not have to pay for it?
Okay, so, and this is probably, I don't think this is going to totally answer your question, but sometimes I'll get a call from a family who really cannot, there's no funds, they cannot do anything. In that case, I have occasionally had people let their loved one go to the state anatomy board in DC. They will eventually, it'll take a long time, but they do have a contract with a funeral home who will handle cremation, and then they are interred. I think it's in Mount Olivet Cemetery, and I don't think there's any money that changes hands in the end if that person, is that impoverished. And same for the Maryland State Anatomy Board, they would handle cremation, and no one would likely get the cremated remains back. Sometimes they'll give them back, and they'll also be interred. Maryland has a cemetery as well. So if you really cannot, there are avenues, but I don't think that that's exactly what you are asking.
That's sufficient. Thank you.
Okay.
When I worked at Joseph's house, the men had no money. So we actually did the public where many bodies were cremated together, and we did not get the ashes necessarily back. So, okay, so I'm looking at some of the other ones. If you donate, this is about the students, about getting them back. A lot of people have a lot of interest in cremation. You can contact, okay, hold on. Just do your own research. Cecilia said you should do your own research. We found one, I think through mortuary after my mother had died, and we're able to take advantage of savings on the burial plot, even though we had not been members. Bob Hoffman is asking us to recommend a highly regarded crematorium in DC.
Okay. So I can tell you different crematories in the area, but the thing is, you're going to have to go through the funeral home. Families don't go directly to the crematory. There are a couple funeral homes. One comes to mind, it's called Going Home, and they have their own crematory on site. So they're sort of the crematory and the funeral home all in one. But there's paperwork that has to be completed before that cremation process that the funeral home is tasked with. The funeral home that we use is called, the crematory we use is called Chesapeake Crematory. That is in Beltsville, Maryland, near the IKEA exit. I think that those guys it's a good crematory. Going Home has its own crematory. Out of Virginia, Metropolitan, they have their own crematory. And actually, there's an old crematory in Pumphrey's, right on Wisconsin, in Bethesda, has their own crematory on site. Now, that would never happen now. That's sort of grandfathered in because most of the time the crematories are more.
And Susan asked about there's no embalming before cremation, right? Unless you want to preserve.
No, you could totally be embalmed before cremation. You could have a full open casket church service, and then you could go to the crematory afterwards.
Well, my question was, if you're not having that, you're just going to
Yes.
be cremated. There's no need
Yes.
for embalming, right?
There is no need. Nope.
Okay.
You know, just in terms of like the embalming versus green or the water cremation or heat cremation, a lot of people want to know like what is really the greenest, like what is the best, and because they all are bad for the earth in some ways, right?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, and
I'm just it's
the best? I mean, it's hard, if you get onto the equipment manufacturers for green cremation, they have lots of statistics about why it is so much better for the earth, because you're not using fossil fuels, it releases less carbon dioxide, you're not releasing metals into the atmosphere like mercury, and it just uses a whole lot less energy. I don't know. I mean, certainly water usage is a real thing too, but when you read it's about 300 gallons per person, they say that really is not that terrible. So I don't think it depends on which information you're reading. Some people, now, for example, in the Buddhist community, that fire is tied to the spirit being released. And so for them, that's probably, that's what they need. They need the fire.
right. Okay, another question from Julia is Congressional Cemetery. How does it compare in price to some of the other ones?
They are, so Congressional Cemetery, funny you ask, I just pulled up their prices today because I was wanted to refresh myself. They had plots that were between, I think, 4,000 and 9,000, and that probably does not cover opening and closing, which is what it's called when they open the grave for the burial and then they close it back. And so that price depended on what section of the cemetery you were in. The older sections, I think, are really filled there, but the newer sections are available. That's in line with a lot of other cemeteries. Honestly, that's pretty much what you should expect. And that's another reason when you think about the burial part, it's not just the funeral home bill. That cemetery bill is probably going to be equal to what the funeral home bill is. Mm-hmm. You're going to be in the $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 kind of range.
And one of our friends, Bob Hoffman, who's helped with our death cafes and our programs for the End of Life Expo, he's done so much work with death podcasts and death videos, and he's also a registered tour guide at the Congressional Cemetery in DC.
Wow.
So you might want to check out Bob's work. He's very excited about telling the great story of the cemetery. It actually is very beautiful. I've gone to funerals there, and I've also taken my dog there, and it's lovely. Okay, Elizabeth asked, how about the opportunity to become part of a coral reef, which I know Vicki in our group here, she also sent information. There was a great article that Vicki sent around. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, so I read that article too. It was last weekend in the weekend section, I think. Mm-hmm. So I checked out that company a little bit more just out of curiosity. It looks like they kind of have different launching spots all along the East Coast, starting in Miami and going up to different spots like New Jersey, Mid-Atlantic. I think they had something off the Carolina coast. And what it looks like to me is that they have kind of launch dates where they say, okay, we're going to take out the boat on this day for this purpose, and we can accept so many different families. And so I think they coordinate several all at once, but they're mixing the cremated remains, so that bone that's remaining gets mixed into that cement reef, which is so heavy they lower it with a crane. They lower it to the bottom of the ocean where it helps rebuild the coral reef system there. But that was I checked out the price of that too. I think it was around $4,000 to do that.
Yeah, it's probably,
I
think it's expensive.
Yeah, and I mean, it sounds like a neat day, and you got out on a boat. There's a family boat, so you're in your boat watching it be lowered, and I think there may be multiple family boats if they're doing more than one at a time.
Right.
Yeah, it sounded neat.
Another quick question from Kathy. Does DC require pre-authorization to be cremated? I had understood that there is a form that needs to be part of your will. Is that accurate?
So it's great to have it specified in your will. Any funeral home is probably going to make you re-sign the authorization all over again because they're going to want it signed at death. So you could pre-authorize, but your next of kin needs to be on, make sure they're on board, and that person is going to be the one who really gives the authorization at death as well. You can pre-plan for it, but when death has occurred, the funeral home is going to want fresh paperwork, authorizing.
Okay, Sharon is asking, if you pass in one state and you want to have a green burial in another state, such as Cool Springs, how do you arrange your transport to the burial site? Is a funeral home involved?
So let's say you want to go out to Cool Springs and you, let's say you live in DC, you use a Maryland funeral home and you want to be buried in Virginia. That is a pretty common scenario around here. So that funeral home in Maryland would pick you up, bring you to the funeral home, perhaps order your shroud or your plain pine box. And then on the day of the service, they would be the ones transporting you to Virginia. They would have to get a burial transit permit from your place of death. So if you died in DC, you'd get a DC burial transit permit, you'd have a DC death certificate, and that would be sufficient to be buried in Virginia. And you would need to have a Virginia licensed funeral director as well. But a funeral home would be able to handle that. That would be a pretty normal scenario.
Marion's asking what funeral home, and you're part of RAP Incorporated.
That's right.
And I can't say enough about RAP. I just have loved them and refer people to them for probably 20 years.
How do you spell that?
RAP is R-A-P-P, like Paul. It's the original owner's last name. He was Richard Rapp, and he was a big proponent of low-cost cremations, and his legacy still lives. And RAP, up until very recently, was independently owned, and it is no longer independently owned, but we still are doing the same work and treating families, and I think the same way. So
I have a contract with RAP.
Oh, you do?
Yeah, got it a long time ago, maybe even 10, 12 years ago.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
It's a treat to see people beforehand.
Yeah.
Very
Yeah,
complicated.
Emmy Lou is very proactive and she's got everything set, right, Emmy Lou?
Pretty much, as far as I know.
Right.
If I don't, somebody else will figure it out.
Yeah.
I
okay.
heard someone ask, RAP is located in downtown Silver Spring. It's really just over the border.
Yeah.
And don't be fooled. It's not a big fancy place with a big curb appeal. Like, that's what I love about it. Like the places that look like they're like Taj Mahal, beware. Okay, so Kathleen says, I want to arrange for my cremation ahead of time. What group does this in DC, in Northern Virginia? Which is the least expensive place to cremate me?
There's a few different ones. I mean, RAP is definitely considered on the lower end of things for sure. Going Home Cremation is another one. They're based out of Maryland as well. There's another called Maryland Cremation Services. Northern Virginia. So let's see here. Advent in Falls Church, they would have a reasonably priced cremation. The thing is, you can call, so what I would do, is call 3 different funeral homes and ask them what their direct cremation price is, because oftentimes those funeral homes are using the same crematory. So they might be a fancier funeral home, but most funeral homes do not have their own crematory. They're going to be using the same crematory as the lower cost funeral home. So I would call and call 3 different places and get their price. And if that's for sure what you want, then you could go ahead and pre-plan and prepay with that same funeral home.
Okay. So we just have a few more minutes. I want to get through a couple more of these. One, Carol saying that what are the cons to prepaying?
So, the bad side is that you're giving up control of money that you had control over, right? So you could get an idea for what type of funeral you want, about how much you think it's going to cost, and you could put it in a different type of savings account and maintain control over it.
Right.
One of the reasons people want to prepay is because if they're trying to qualify for Medicaid, it allows them, that's one of the ways to spend down your assets to qualify for Medicaid. So there are times where it makes, real sense to do it. And sometimes people just want to do it because then it's done. And their kids don't have to worry about it. There's no discussions. It is the peace of mind factor. But I think there were cons, and I think that part of the business has become so regulated because there were bad actors that I don't hear malicious things happening right now. I mean, you might be at a funeral home that charges more, but in my experience, people carry out what they're supposed to. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to read another question.
Okay.
Were you going to finish what you're going to say?
Oh, no, I was going to say there's sometimes where people will change things and they may end up paying a little bit, but it should be nominal. You should get, what was prepaid for would be guaranteed.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you would want to make sure that it's guaranteed contract.
Yeah. I think you already answered this. So the procedure for transporting remains across the country, or sometimes even across the world, right? Like the funeral home helps arrange that.
So for cremated remains, we see most people, and we have people take cremated remains all over the world from here. You put them in your carry-on bag. It's great if they're in an urn that's not metal. A lot of times when you do a direct cremation, you're given it's not beautiful, it's functional. It's a black plastic box. It's called a temporary urn. And that's what your cremated remains are returned in to you if you don't get a nicer urn. The temporary urn, while not beautiful, is great for travel. It's light. It goes through the metal detector at the airport. If they want to open it, they can. You're going to have a cremation certificate with you that states that those are cremated remains. And we just don't hear horror stories from TSA. I think they're pretty good at that at this point. And so, yeah, you carry on. Put it in your carry-on. That's the biggest thing. And try not to have a metal urn. And I would say have something that is openable. If they want to open and inspect further, have something that's openable.
So Adrian's asking about, is there a limit on the age for organ donation, of when your organs are not welcomed? And I know that for some of my clients who have memory loss or Parkinson's, that they plan on donating their brains for science. So what do you think about some other organs that might have a time limit, expiration date?
I mean, there is no, I have read, you have to be over 18, but I've never seen an expiration date. But I do know, based on what they're looking for, they could decide not to take your body. The brain donation a lot of times happens out of Johns Hopkins, it seems like. That's who's handling that. Mm-hmm. I see the DC to Georgia without being embalmed.
Yeah.
Yeah, you'd have to, so you would be driving the body. You would need to keep it cool. You would be getting a funeral home to do that for you. They're probably going to charge you a pretty good amount of mileage. They would probably recommend flying. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to ask about flying.
Yeah, you could fly. You don't have to be embalmed to fly domestically. Internationally, most of the time, unless it's Israel, it's required.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not the funeral home who requires it. Normally they say it's the airlines. It's very country specific. We certainly do. We transport bodies all over the world. And most of the time, almost always they're embalmed. But yeah, no, we would just book you a flight and you could go down there unembalmed. We would send you with ice packs and keep you cool and try not to have any, layovers. That's what I would do.
I once had a hospice patient who was a rabbi, and the family needed to get the body to Israel within 24 hours, and they kept asking me to predict the death. And it was very hard because they needed to make their airline arrangements. So that's always tricky, you know. I think also in your role, Lily, you've had to know what the different cultural norms are for different religious traditions, and that's a big part of your
Yeah,
job.
it's my favorite. I did an Eritrean Orthodox service last week, and I did a Ethiopian Orthodox service the week before, and
Wow.
I love that. I was, you know, you have to cover your head and no shoes in the church, so barefoot with head covered. I love it. I love that.
So the next question by the Colemans is interesting to me because I've always put cremains of my dogs in places I probably shouldn't. And is there a law about disposing the cremains if not in cemeteries, like putting them in the Potomac River or the ocean or the Chesapeake Bay?
Yeah, I think, okay, so there are EPA, Environmental Protection Agency laws, certainly regarding oceans. Any local stream, creek, river is going to be in the local authority box. So first of all, cremated remains are bone. It's calcium phosphate. It's not, you know, there's no, it's not going to hurt anything. And most people I find are just doing discreet scattering. It's more of a don't ask, don't tell situation. But yeah, there are local laws. With the ocean, it's pretty interesting. Like the EPA, they want you to be 3 nautical miles offshore. And they used to have a depth requirement, but I think they have removed that depth requirement. The Potomac specifically, I don't know. I'll have to look that up. I should know that, and I really don't. I think most people just go out and do it, to be honest. But
Yeah, right.
you know, I don't know if anybody's ever seen those articles at Disneyland. Apparently, tons of people go to Disneyland and cast cremated remains, and they have like dedicated vacuums to go and cleaning up the cremated remains. So just beware where you put them. You could end up in someone's vacuum.
Right. Someone else is asking about other research institutions like across the country that might accept bodies for donation. University of Tennessee used to have a forensic death and decay research. Yeah, I also think like the Mayo Clinic around cancer, like I'm sure must be big research institutions that would welcome more cadavers.
Yes, I think you're right about that. I think it would be more like research specific. So what does this person, you know, have? What are they suffering from? And then that may be in line with that organization wanting you. The University of Tennessee, the Body Farm, it's my understanding that is still, you know, alive and well. The Body Farm, I've always wanted to go there. It's interesting to me. I don't know if I'd want to, you know, have my loved one there, but yeah. Are you familiar with it, Dixie?
No, I don't. What's a body farm?
The Body Farm is people will donate their bodies. It is through the University of Tennessee, and they just have them out, exposed in different sorts of scenarios so that they can research decay. Yeah.
It has some serious forensic uses where, you know, when police find a body, it helps them give an idea how long the person has been dead or where the body was. I mean, there's a lot of really sophisticated research with it. I'm glad they're still in operation.
Yes.
Okay, so Sharon asked about if she doesn't have a next of kin about hiring a power of attorney. And yes, you know, you can call Iona and we can help you out with that, Sharon. You know, there are guardians, you know, lawyers and non-lawyers who can serve as guardians and power of attorney, but give us a call and we'll help you out with that question. And there's many people in DC that don't have available next of kin. And I just want to make a comment that it doesn't have to be next of kin. You can always ask a friend that loves you and knows you to serve in that role. And sometimes they actually are they know you better than your next of kin. The important thing is that you choose somebody who knows what you want and not what they want for you. Okay. And then let's see what else. Deborah, can my body go directly to the crematory? I think we answered that one. National Park Service frowns. Deborah said they frown on
do.
scattering in federal park land.
They do frown. I was actually just doing some recent research on this, but I don't know. They don't like it, but I don't know that it's illegal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. For body composting, does the person need to be naked, no metal, etc.?
I think so. The metal part, let's say you have a hip replacement or a knee replacement, during the decomposition process, towards the end of it, they remove those items. I think there's kind of like a sifter and those items are removed. The same thing happens with fire cremation. You know, you occasionally, I have been asked, you know, for someone, can I have my mother's hip back? And you can. I don't know what you're going to do with it, but you can get your mom's hip back. Yeah, so that does not break down during the process, and it wouldn't break down, you know, if it doesn't break down in 2000 degrees, it's definitely not going to break down in soil. So those would just be, typically they're set aside and they are recycled. And yes, I do think you would need to be naked or shrouded.
Adrienne, did you have a question that you wanted to ask?
I had a whole lot of things. I've forgotten a lot of them now, but my body is scheduled to go to Howard's Medical School.
Oh,
Right.
wonderful.
And, but it's a good idea to check in with whoever you've donated your body to, just to make sure that things are still in place. Because I've done this for years, and I called down to make sure that I was still in their database, and I couldn't get anybody on the phone. Well, that's not good if your body is scheduled to be donated, because they have to get that body right away. And fortunately, I was still alive, so that wasn't a problem. But it's a good idea to check on your proceedings to make sure things are in place, because if I had died, then they would have had to find some other way to dispose of my body.
Right.
It would have been too late to get it in there. So I just want to make that point.
I totally agree with you. I think you need a backup plan for body donation, because if they're not receiving at that moment for whatever reason, you need another plan. But we still have people go to Howard. I assume it's fine. I have not seen anything otherwise.
Well, Lily, I don't know if there's other questions. There may be, but they could probably contact you at RAP possibly if they have additional questions.
Totally.
And this has been so informative for me. And I felt like I was pretty informed already about this, but I've learned so much.
Yeah.
And it's just been a great opportunity to ask some very frank questions that people probably always wondered about, but didn't have the courage to formulate the question. And, you know, we all are death is a mystery, and, you know, we've all had different traditional experiences, but part of the goal of having this program is to kind of expand. We name this topic thinking outside the box or the wall. And, you know, we don't have to die the way our parents or grandparents died. We don't, you know, there's all new ways of doing it. So I'm so grateful that you've expanded our understanding and in such a kind, thoughtful way. And the presentation was amazing.
Oh, well, thank you. I really enjoyed this. I am glad to answer your questions. You can reach out to me. You can reach out to Dixie or Lena, and they'll get your questions to me, I'm sure. But thank you for having me. I love Iona. I'm such a big fan. So it's really special to me to be with you guys. So thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh, I see Edwina Smith. Yes, my dad's in Honey Creek Woodlands.
We're delighted
Where is
to
that,
have
Edwina?
you with us, and I'm going to put this someplace on our website, and I will email everybody who signed up and let you know where it is, so you can refer to it when you need it. And I will include Lily's email address on. You want me to include your RAP email address?
You could include either, you know, if it's wrap
Okay.
related or just a general mortician question, you could include my personal or professional, either
Okay.
one.
Okay,
Lena, can I say one more thing?
sure.
There's a lot in this presentation that was completely new to me. The water cremation, there was just there's been a lot of updates. Is there a transcript that we can receive about, or
Well,
where we can-
there's not a transcript, but I'm going to put the whole video up so you can watch it again if you want to.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you,
This is
everybody.
great.
Bye, you
Thank
all.
you so much.
Very
Stay
good.
well.
Very good.
Okay,
Thanks so much.
okay, great.
Bye. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Lily.
Thank you, Lily.
Have a nice afternoon.
Okay.